2 out of 3 Gen X women never got a tattoo, which means you likely watched 30 years of trends pass you by without jumping in. You saw the tribal armbands, the lower back pieces, and those infinity signs with the word breathe looped through them. Yet you kept walking past every single shop. Every so often, someone finally notices the lack of ink. You might be at a cookout with your sleeves rolled up, when a friend who has known you for years looks at your bare arm with a mix of confusion and curiosity. They ask if you really don't have a single tattoo, and you watch them recalibrate while they try to decide if you are principled, private, or if you just somehow missed the memo. You usually just shrug, refill your cup, and move on with your day. But that blank skin isn't random, and it certainly isn't a gap in your life story. By the end of this video, you will understand that your choice is actually a very revealing psychological trait, and what it says about you is a lot more interesting than most people assume. You belong to the bridge generation for tattoos because you watched the practice transform in real time. You saw it move from something reserved for bikers and sailors into a service you could buy on a Tuesday afternoon at a strip mall between a nail salon and a Subway. This massive cultural shift happened during your adult years, not your parents' years, which makes your perspective unique. Data from Pew Research shows that about a third of Gen X adults have at least one tattoo. But when you compare that to the 56% of women under 30 who have ink today, the gap tells a clear story. The most interesting number isn't the group that got them, but rather the 2/3 who didn't. You had every opportunity to join in, including clean studios with portfolios on the walls and friends who went in pairs on Friday nights. By the late 1990s, the culture had already decided tattoos were normal enough that even your coworker's mom probably had one. You were the right age, you had the access, and the social permission was already there. Despite all of that, you still said no. Your refusal wasn't loud, and there was never a big announcement or a moral speech about it. The no was quiet and almost entirely private. It happened every single time without much explanation, and then life moved on while the moment passed. Somewhere in the background, that quiet no just kept accumulating year after year until 30 years went by and your skin remained blank. Try to picture a specific moment from 1997 when you were outside a studio with a couple of friends on a Friday night. One of them is heading inside, and they look at you and ask if you're coming along. Something flickers in your mind, and you think about it for a real second while looking at the flash art on the window. You feel the pull of the moment and the warmth of the group, along with that particular Friday night feeling where anything seems possible. Then, something quiet inside you says no, so you stay on the sidewalk while your friend goes in. She comes out an hour later with her new wrist wrapped in plastic, and you tell her it looks great, because it does. And that is the end of the story. This likely happened more than once, with different years, different studios, and different designs that were briefly interesting before they weren't. The answer never changed. But people still tend to assume that your answer was based on fear. They think it was a fear of the needle, the pain, or the long-term commitment. That is the easy way to read the situation, but it is also completely wrong. The women who never got a tattoo weren't the fearful ones in the room in many cases. They were the ones doing the most thinking. So what was actually happening in your head every single time that quiet no arrived, before you had even consciously decided anything? The easy answer is fear. But fear is the wrong angle entirely. The real reason you never got that tattoo wasn't a fear of needles, and it was actually something much more specific that most people never quite name correctly. It was a problem with permanence, but not as some abstract concept you couldn't wrap your head around. You struggled with permanence as it applies to a person who never stops changing, because you understood at a gut level that the version of you sitting in that chair in 1997 was not going to be the final version. Think about what that moment actually felt like when you were 22 and looking at a design while a question surfaced in the back of your mind. You wondered if you would still want that image on your skin at 45. But most people just brush that thought off and keep going. They assume their future self is basically just their current self with a few more wrinkles and a slightly better salary, meaning they expect to have the same tastes and values forever. You couldn't make that assumption because you had already watched yourself become a completely different person once or twice, and that evidence was getting very hard to ignore. Between the ages of 15 and 22, you changed in ways that were not small or subtle. The music that felt like it understood your soul at 16 was embarrassing by the time you turned 21, and the political opinions you held at 19 had already shifted into something much more complicated. Relationships that felt like they would last forever ended. Things you were certain about turned out to be phases, and things you dismissed ended up being the only things that mattered. By the time you were old enough to walk into a studio alone and make a real decision, you already had enough personal data to know your own data was not stable. You were watching yourself update in real time, and the truth was that the update cycle was moving faster than anyone liked to admit. When you sat there trying to picture yourself at 40, what you actually saw was a total stranger whose tastes you could not predict. You had no reliable access to that person's career, politics, or sense of humor, and you realized they might look back at your 22-year-old judgment with the same relief you felt that your 16-year-old self wasn't in charge of anything permanent. You realized you weren't willing to make a lifelong decision on behalf of someone you hadn't even met yet. That isn't fear, but rather a specific cognitive style that looks much further down the road than most people do. You treat irreversibility as a real cost rather than a romantic feature, and you weight future regret very heavily when you evaluate the decisions you make today. It is the same thinking that makes you read every word of a contract before signing it, even when everyone else at the table has already picked up their pen. The data actually backs up your hesitation, because about 1 in 4 tattooed Americans say they regret at least one of their pieces. The pattern in that regret is very consistent, since the people most likely to feel bad about their ink are the ones who got it when they were young. The people who took the longest to decide are the ones who ended up the most satisfied, or in your case, the ones who kept deciding that the right answer was still no. The 22-year-old version of you that you refused to trust turned out to be statistically correct. The designs that felt deeply meaningful in 1996 are sitting on someone's upper arm right now, looking like a document from a different century. You see the tribal armbands, the matching tattoos couples got a week before they split up, and the Chinese characters that were supposed to mean strength, but actually mean noodle. You didn't make those mistakes because you were paying attention to the version of yourself that would have to live with the consequences. That future version of you wasn't someone you knew well enough to trust with a permanent choice, so you chose to wait. But there was a second layer happening at the same time, and it had nothing to do with who you might become in 20 years. More than 90% of the people watching this video right now are not subscribed to the channel. If you are starting to realize that your blank canvas was actually a decades-long act of psychological independence, you belong in a community that values that kind of internal depth. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and share this with one person who needs to hear it. Now let's continue. The second layer of your decision was about the wave itself. And I don't mean the tattoo of a wave, but the cultural wave of the trend. You watched it build from the very beginning when the tribal armband first showed up around 1994 or 1995. The first people who got those designs genuinely meant something by them, and it felt like a raw choice that carried real weight for their lives. Then, inside of 18 months, that same design was on every guy at every sports bar in every mid-sized city in America. The meaning didn't travel with the art, so the design just traveled alone. Then came the lower back pieces, followed by the Chinese characters that were supposed to be profound, but turned out to say soup or table because the artist didn't check the reference book. You saw the dolphins on hips, the dream catchers, and the infinity signs with the word breathe written through the middle. That specific design appeared on almost every woman between the ages of 28 and 40 around 2013. And then it quietly became the thing nobody mentioned anymore. You watched each of these cycles run their full course from start to finish. You saw the exact moment something personal became a mass-produced product, and you watched people get something permanently installed on their skin based on what was hanging on the studio wall that season. Something inside of you kept pulling back from that process. It is worth being clear that you weren't being judgmental or rolling your eyes at the people who got them. You liked a good tattoo as much as anyone else, and you could appreciate a piece that was specific, considered, and genuinely personal. What you were reacting to wasn't the ink itself, but the predictable pattern that was happening underneath the ink. The pattern was simple. A thing that starts as a real expression of someone's identity moves into mass production incredibly quickly. The meaning hollows out during that transfer, and the people who moved early enough to say something unique end up sharing a design with 3 strangers at the same bar. Your generation has actually been measured on this specific trait. Marketing researchers have tracked these habits for decades, and they always arrive at the same description of Gen X. You have the highest skepticism toward group enthusiasm of any living cohort. And the phrase that keeps appearing in that research is BS detector. When the crowd starts moving in one direction, your instinct isn't to follow them, but to slow down and ask who started the movement and why they did it. That instinct isn't just cynicism. It is high-level pattern recognition that you built from years of experience. You spent your adult life watching trends arrive, peak, embarrass people, and disappear on a reliable schedule. And you internalized that cycle without even trying. By the time a trend was everywhere, you had already noticed the gap between what it meant to the first person and what it meant once it was on a most requested list. There was also a practical layer to this that was very specific to women in your generation. The workplace in the 1990s was not neutral about visible nonconformity, and that was especially true for women's bodies. You were figuring out how to be taken seriously in professional environments that had very strong opinions about how a credible woman should look. And visible tattoos carried a specific cost in those rooms. It wasn't like that everywhere, but it happened enough that you learned to read the gap between what something signals and what it actually costs you. That kind of awareness doesn't just switch off when you leave the office for the day. Once you can see the gap between a signal and a cost, you start to see it everywhere you look. What you saw when you looked at each new tattoo trend was a decision being made for the current moment, the current version of yourself, and the current cultural conversation. You felt like people weren't accounting for what happens when that current moment inevitably passes. You were refusing the wave, and the specific design you almost got was incidental. What you kept declining was the logic of doing something permanent just because it happened to feel resonant right now. That is a real psychological feature of who you are, and your blank arm is the cleanest piece of evidence for it. Psychology generally splits the way we carry our identity into two different buckets. One is external, where you build yourself outward using visible markers and signals so other people can read who you are at a glance. The other is internal, which is something you carry privately through your own experiences, memories, and relationships. This version of self-esteem doesn't depend on anyone else being able to see it to make it real. While most people use a little bit of both, where you place your center of gravity actually matters quite a bit. Research on body self-awareness consistently shows that stable self-esteem correlates most strongly with an integrated internal identity, rather than how many external markers you collect. The women with the most solid sense of self aren't always the ones who are the most visibly expressive, but they are usually the ones whose identity is anchored somewhere that doesn't shift when the world around them changes. For many Gen X women, that anchor was dropped deep inside from a very early age. You knew things about yourself that you didn't feel any particular need to broadcast to the world, like what music actually moved you, or what you believed when the room wasn't watching. Your inner life was full, and it belonged entirely to you. So adding external proof of it felt a little beside the point, almost like hanging a sign on your own front door just to remind yourself that you live there. Pew Research has some data on why people get tattoos that is worth sitting with for a moment. Around 69% of tattooed Americans say a major reason for their ink was to honor or remember someone or something important. That is a significant number because it tells you exactly what the tattoo is doing psychologically. It functions as a signpost, which is a way of putting a piece of your identity outside your body where it can be pointed at and shared. It answers the question of who you are in a way that doesn't require you to find the right words in a difficult moment. You never really needed that signpost because the answer to that question was already somewhere you could access it whenever you wanted. You didn't feel the need to mount your history on your forearm just to keep it safe. Think about how this shows up in smaller ways that have absolutely nothing to do with needles or ink. You don't need to wear the vintage band shirt to prove you love the music, and you don't need to post the vacation photo to confirm the trip actually happened. The meaning of a song or a moment doesn't require a container to hold it. It lives inside you, and because you know exactly where to find it, the external world doesn't need an invitation to see it. Younger generations often look at this differently, and the reason is worth understanding rather than judging. Growing up under constant digital observation changes how identity feels, especially when your face is in 1,000 photos taken without your permission. When your social media bio has to be perfectly legible and you are being categorized every time you open an app, identity starts to feel slippery and unstable. A tattoo becomes one of the few ways to nail something in place and say that at least this one part is fixed and mine in a way the algorithm can't touch. That was never your problem because you built your adult self before anyone was watching you. The self that formed during those years, including your opinions and your quiet convictions, did so in private, without the pressure to make it make sense to strangers. Nobody needed proof of who you were, so you never developed the habit of producing it for them. Your identity didn't feel slippery because it wasn't being monitored by 1,000 eyes, so it remained yours alone. A self that was built in private simply doesn't develop that same hunger for external confirmation. You don't look at a design and think it will finally make your personality real, because you already feel real. The skin adds nothing, because nothing was missing in the first place. That is actually one of the most underrated features of your generation, which is a stable inner sense of self that doesn't go looking for outside evidence. Having blank skin isn't proof of a blank interior. It is actually the exact opposite. A big part of why that private self felt stable enough to stand on its own comes from something much earlier, specifically how you were raised. A lot of Gen X women grew up coming home to an empty house on a regular basis. The key was usually on a string around your neck or hidden under the mat, and you'd had your own copy since you were 9 years old. You let yourself in, made a snack, and handled the next few hours of your life without a single adult checking in to see how you were doing. That might sound unremarkable to you now, but it trained a specific kind of psychology into your brain. When there is no adult in the room, you eventually become the adult in the room, and this happened quietly over years of small decisions. You stopped expecting someone to arrive and tell you what to do, so your internal compass developed because it was the only one available. The result of that upbringing wasn't just practical independence, like knowing how to use the toaster or finish your homework. It was something much deeper, which was a genuinely low need for external markers of belonging. You didn't grow up inside a digital system that was constantly labeling and sorting you into groups. You grew up mostly unobserved, which meant you had to make your own call about who you were and what that meant. Tattoos have always functioned as tribal signals, which is one of their oldest roles in human culture. They tell the world that you are part of a specific group or a movement, and they answer the question of belonging with something permanent. For people who grew up hungry for that kind of visible membership, that function has a very real pull. You didn't feel that pull the same way because you already knew how to be yourself without a group confirming it. The latchkey years built that into your bones. Belonging was never something you required visible proof of, mostly because you had spent too many afternoons alone figuring yourself out without anyone else's help. The workplace in the 1990s reinforced this on a completely different level. Women navigating professional environments back then learned very quickly that the smartest presentation was neutral, competent, and what people called low drama. Visible nonconformity cost more for women than it did for men, and it attracted a specific kind of scrutiny that had nothing to do with your actual talent. You learned to move through those rooms cleanly without giving anyone a hook to hang a judgment on, and that skill became a permanent default. Personality research actually catches something very real here. Studies comparing people with and without tattoos consistently find that those who avoid permanent body modification score higher on conscientiousness. This is a trait that includes being planful and thinking very carefully before making visible commitments. The non-tattooed group tends to be much slower to finalize anything that carries a lasting cost because they are more attentive to the downstream consequences. That profile fits the latchkey experience almost perfectly. A child who manages themselves alone develops a version of responsibility that isn't taught in a classroom, but grown out of necessity. You weren't drilled in these traits, but you developed them because acting on impulse didn't work when you were the only one home and the only one accountable for what happened next. It is important to say that this has nothing to do with being timid or afraid of change. The women who came home to empty houses and figured things out were not the ones who lacked confidence. They were the ones who built their confidence from the inside out, on a foundation that didn't require anyone else to be in the room to hold it up. The self that grew up that way doesn't reach for external proof that it exists, because it already knows the truth. Your blank arm isn't the mark of someone who never decided who she was. It is the mark of someone who decided a long time ago, in a quiet house, without an audience, and she never felt the need to post an announcement about it. All of that skepticism and independence feeds into one final psychological trait that ties this whole story together. Think about the big decisions you have made and then unmade throughout your life. You might have left a job that no longer fit, moved away from a city that felt too small, or watched a long-term relationship change shape over time. Most of the important choices you make as an adult have a door built into them, which acts as a way to adjust when new information shows up. That is not a sign of weakness, but rather how a person who has watched things break actually operates in the real world. You learned through experience that the smart move is almost never to lock every door at once, because you need to keep room for the next update. You hold your conclusions a little loosely, not because you lack conviction, but because you know that conviction without flexibility tends to age badly. A tattoo is one of the only decisions in modern life that does not come with an easy door, and that is the part people tend to understate when they talk about it. Removal exists, but it is expensive, painful, and usually incomplete, meaning the ghost of the original design stays behind on your skin. You do not get a clean surface back, but instead, you get a permanent reminder that something was there, which is almost a worse outcome than keeping the original. This decision is about as close to genuinely irreversible as anything in ordinary life, and that specific quality is what triggered your allergy to the idea. This is not a fear of commitment, and that distinction matters enough that we should be direct about it. Gen X women commit to careers and build them over decades. They commit to people and mean it, and they hold on to their values even when those values are not popular. The capacity for commitment was never the issue here. But what you are allergic to is a specific subset of choices that cannot be refined when your understanding grows. Your 22-year-old self had a specific politics and a specific relationship, and she probably had a tattoo picked out that felt right in that particular year of her life. You did not do it because some part of you understood that your younger self was going to be wrong about some of those things. She was not wrong about everything, but she was wrong enough that you did not want her signing off on anything permanent that you would have to carry today. The research on regret follows this exact logic, showing that the people least likely to regret permanent decisions are the ones who waited the longest to make them. These people let the initial impulse sit and watched how they felt across different seasons of their life before they finally committed to the choice. The ones who moved fast on permanent choices are the ones who end up at the removal clinic years later, explaining that who they were then and who they are now are not the same person. You already knew that because you had lived through enough of your own updates to understand that the self has a revision history that never truly stops. Keeping the door open is not the same as being unable to walk through one, but is instead a conscious strategy to protect your future self from the certainty of your present version. It is the knowledge that you will keep changing, and it represents a deliberate choice not to staple yourself to any particular chapter of your story. The blank canvas is not the result of someone who could never make up her mind. It is the result of someone who made up her mind over and over across 30 years and kept arriving at the same answer of not yet. Maybe that answer was not ever, but either way, that choice was protecting something important. When someone at a party looks at your bare arm and asks why you do not have a single tattoo, they think they are asking a simple question about a missing detail. They are actually asking why you opted out of one of the loudest, visible identity commitments of your entire adult lifetime. Across 3 decades of social permission and a culture that kept making it easier to get inked, you kept arriving at the same quiet answer. The long version of that answer is a psychological profile, because you run a different algorithm than most people. You take permanence seriously in a way that is not obvious until someone points it out, and you do not trust the version of yourself that is currently most enthusiastic about a trend. You have watched that version of yourself be wrong often enough to treat its certainty with skepticism, and you do not trust group momentum because you have seen the full arc of those movements too many times. You do not want to bind the person you will be at 60 to a decision the person you were at 28 thought was a great idea. That is not a gap in your personality, but a coherent way of moving through the world that very few people have the patience to maintain for 30 years. The culture around you has spent the last 2 decades moving toward maximum visibility, telling you to announce yourself and put your values on your sleeve. Identity became something you were expected to broadcast, and the louder the broadcast, the more you were supposed to exist in the eyes of others. You went the other direction, not as a protest or a loud statement, but as the quiet result of being wired a little differently. What that produced is something that is actually quite rare in the modern world, which is the fact that you can still be a surprise to people. The person meeting you for the first time does not already have the summary of who you are because your identity is not pre-printed on the outside of the package. They have to actually talk to you and spend time with you to understand your story. And what they find is a person rather than a confirmation of a stereotype. That is what the blank skin represents, as it is not a canvas that was never filled, but a self that was built somewhere private. You grew without being watched, and you never needed the outside of your body to carry the proof of what was happening on the inside. The women who stayed unmarked were not the ones who could not commit, but were the ones who understood that some things are worth protecting from a permanent decision made in a temporary moment. They knew that the version of yourself who shows up at 22 or 30 is not the final version of who you are. Leaving room for the next version of yourself is not a failure of conviction, but is instead a deep form of respect for the person you are still becoming. The blank canvas was never empty, and it was actually the most deliberate statement you ever made. You finally have the psychological language to describe what that 30-year no was actually doing for you. It was never a gap or a missing piece, but rather a fortress built to protect a self that is still becoming. This blank canvas represents the quietest and most deliberate statement of independence you have ever made. While most people would have looked for an easier way to belong, you possessed the internal depth to wait. By staying unmarked, you protected that rare ability to still be a surprise in a world that demands everyone be prepackaged. Your choice proves that the most important parts of who you are do not need to be seen to be real. If this realization felt powerful, the next video reveals the hidden psychological scripts that govern how you handle your most private relationships.